so the history of mad people from ancient times to the present is a long history, long history. And by mad people, of course, is a term that's contentious. I'm not pretending there is no term that would be neutral. People who have a psychiatric disability today have historically been called mad. It's the oldest term used in history, going back literally to ancient times, so that's the term I choose to use. Other terms used are terms that are often ones we would no longer use today or would see as stigmatizing, such as lunatic or insane, crazy, etc. So we had lots of terms, but I use the term mad people from a historical point of view because it's the one that used longest over time, and we'll talk about that as we go through. But this is just obviously not ancient times, more recent than ancient times, but this is just to start off by remembering where we have some local history in this regard, and that's not too far from here, 999 Queen Street West, downtown, Queen and Ossington. It was the asylum for the insane, a provincial lunatic asylum when it originally opened in 1850, and now is the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health. And you can see it's a kind of an idealized picture of the old asylum. From this drawing was made in 1890. The porch, for example, didn't actually exist like that. It looks quite grand, but they didn't actually have the money to build the porch, so that's how the artist conceived it rather than how it actually really was. But nevertheless, it's an accurate depiction of the rest of the actual physical structure in terms of its size. It was the biggest building of its kind when it opened in Canada West, or what is now called the province of Ontario. And the tower, which is at the center, was the CN Tower of its day. It was literally as famous in its day as the CN Tower is today. People came from miles around, and Toronto was 3 miles to the east. This was out in the countryside, and of course within 30 years Toronto surpassed it, and when Parkdale was founded in 1879, and so it was only out in the countryside for less than 30 years. But it has a long history to this day of mad people's history on this very site that's very important, including patients helping to build and maintain the site, which we'll talk about. But of course, going back to ancient times, we can talk about mad people's history much more distant than any of us could think of in terms of our own city. And this goes back to ancient Babylon. In the book of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar is written about. His is the first name of a mad person in history. Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon, which of course is now what would be called Iraq. He said that he went up to the top of his palace, that he was greater than God. God struck him down as being too vain, and he wandered about on the grass for 7 years, on all fours, eating leaves and out with the animals, cast out with the animals. And you can see in this depiction, it's taken from a book by Roy Porter on the history of madness, that he's literally animalistic in his depiction. And it's not until he repented of his claiming he was greater than God that God forgave him. He was put back on his throne and he was returned to normalcy. But the lesson from this is madness equals badness. And madness is punishment from on high for some transgression on earth. And the only way to get over it is to basically ask God's forgiveness. So it's a very negative interpretation of madness historically. As you can see, he's literally depicted in the most animalistic way. And so it's also mad people as othered and as someone to fear. There is a history of positive images of mad people in history from ancient times, having divine wisdom, for example. But generally, that was overshadowed by the much more negative perceptions, which Nebuchadnezzar's story has from the book of Daniel, and it's persisted throughout time. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, such as in this depiction of Jesus, there is also known as charity towards mad people, which is well known, that you're supposed to be supportive in some way, offer some sort of support. It was your religious and faith obligation to be supportive and compassionate towards mad people. And in this depiction, Jesus is consoling the woman who her hand is on her face. And in ancient times, in pre-literate times, it was known that there's a couple of physical signs in pre-literate signs that would show someone was mad, and if someone in a painting was like that, that meant they were mad. but you didn't have people who were all pre-literate would have known that. So Jesus is also obviously in this depiction healing a mad person. And of course, sadness and madness is very much linked. Melancholia, as is in this depiction by Albert Dürer in the 16th century, is also very well known. And it was known in particular to depict the feminine depiction of madness was very common, and for someone who was depressed. And so there are also gendered interpretations. To be depressed was supposedly to be soft or weak or not being capable of carrying on, and so it was often depicted in a way that if a man became depressed, it was stigmatized as he was being weak and had to pull himself up by his bootstraps, quote unquote. So there's a lot of moralistic images as well, and in particular, the way in which women were depicted had often dreadful consequences for women's experiences. This depiction is as sadness, and this one is mood madness. Literally, you can see the crescent-shaped moon hitting the woman on the head in medieval times. This is medieval Europe, and it's coming from the moon, and the moon has the devil in it. So there is a devilish influence. So what happened to women, it wasn't any coincidence, it happened to be women who are depicted in this image. Many women were burned at the stake, who we now recognize were probably experiencing some form of madness in medieval periods and early modern periods. In 14 to 1600 in Europe, it's estimated at least 200,000 people were burned at the stake, most of whom were women, and that's conservative estimates. A lot of places that happened, they weren't tabulating in statistics in small villages or things like that. So many of the people were believed to be people who had some sort of a mental disability or psychiatric disability, as would now be termed, who were literally burned at the stake for being ostracized during this period. And there were also religious minorities who would also be ostracized and burned at the stake during this period, such as during the Black Death in the mid-14th century. Jews were often blamed and scapegoated for spreading the Black Death, which we know was a total lie. Similarly, people with disabilities who were physically different would often be blamed for creating sort of havoc in the local community if there was some sort of illness of some kind. And people were unfortunately often looking for scapegoats amongst the most vulnerable and least protected, whether they be people with physical disabilities, mental disabilities, or religious minorities. Here is a depiction of a woman who actually lived, Margaret, who was Alsace. She was the daughter of Hans Alsace. He was a Burgermeister in Bavaria, which is the equivalent of a mayor. So she was well-to-do. And you say, well, what kind of treatment were mad people given in this period? Well, this was about the closest treatment you could get if you remember from the upper crust. Most mad people lived in the community and didn't have any sort of supports or treatment outside of their family, generally speaking. Until the medieval period, there was some efforts at different times to offer supports in the local communities, such as through the Elizabethan Poor Laws beginning in 1601. But generally speaking, if you didn't have family, you were expected to survive in whatever way was expected. And the number one occupation of mad people, if it can be called that, was begging. So if you had a family that supported you, this was the sort of treatment that one could potentially expect. And this is considered a fortunate mad person. But as you can see, Margaret has a chain on her ankle. She was literally chained into a prayer house in Bavaria, and so she was brought to a prayer house, a Catholic prayer house, and a lay woman was paid to pray for her recovery, and this is where she was chained. And as you can imagine, it would have created even more mental distress during this time as well. And this is how, by the way, how we know of the first-person experiences of mad people during this time. Throughout history, the vast majority of experiences of mad people from their own perspectives are few and far between. That's not hard to figure out because most of the world was illiterate, and most mad people were amongst the majority who were poor. And of course, they didn't have literacy skills. But we do know some examples where people wrote down what mad people expressed, and in this case, the monks who ran the prayer houses would record what they actually said. And so we have some first-person accounts through transcribers about what people like Margaret said and others, because the monks recorded them all in Latin, and so historians many centuries later would start looking at these. It really wasn't until the 17 and 1800s that, which I'll be getting to in a few minutes, that we really get first-person accounts from mad people. A little bit earlier. And this was also common in Germany in the 1500s, as mad people were taken from the community and restrained to be brought to prayer houses. It was very common. Also, there is also a cross-disability connection where people were depicted in ways that were, we would today see as discriminatory, and also used as fools, literally dressed up as fools, as entertainment. Klaus Narr was a person with what we would now call a developmental disability, and like people who were mad people, he was dressed up and literally treated as what we would today call a jester, but were then called fools. Klaus Narr was a real person who actually lived, and the term Narr today, this day in Germany, don't speak German, but according to people who do, to be a Narr means to be a fool in Germany. So unfortunately his name has become pejorative in the German language. And ships of fools also existed, in which mad people, as well as people with what we would call developmental disabilities, supposedly were sent around the ports of Europe without people letting them into ports of entry, and you can see them all dressed up like jesters. In this particular boat, Foucault made this particularly famous in his History of Madness. Only problem is that historians have since looked at it and found there were actually no real ships of fools. It became a metaphor. So there's a bit of a problem when you read Foucault's work on this topic, that the actual actual ships of fools didn't actually exist. He took it as literally, when in fact it was more of a metaphor for how people were genuinely excluded. So that's some area that needs to be interpreted in different ways than was originally proposed by Foucault, although the point he was getting at was the stigma that existed, and that was certainly very true. And so when you think of, by the way, clowns have a direct history from this history. There was mad fools, which is self-explanatory, artificial fools like Balakana and Markov, who lived in Germany, and they were dressed up and made to put on display as well for the entertainment of the aristocracy and the rich. And they literally had twigs put in their hair. That meant they were natural fools. They would today be considered people with developmental disabilities. There was also crippled fools, quote unquote. These are all terms, of course, which are very offensive today, but terms that were common then with people with physical disabilities. And then there were artificial fools. Sorry, I said that Balakana and Markov were artificial fools. Correct myself. Natural fools. Natural fools. They were natural fools, which is why their hair was dressed, put leaves and twigs in their hair. Artificial fools were those who would make fun, quote unquote, in quotes, that would mock mad fools, natural fools, and crippled fools, as the terms were, and they became called jesters and are now called clowns. So when you see a clown in a parade, that comes directly from this history. So it has a very grim history in disability and mad people's history, where people were literally held up to ridicule. There is also famous mad fools amongst the aristocracy. Most mad people who are mad were from the poor, but there was also rich mad people. Queen Juana of Castile. She was the queen for a long time there, but she was locked up in the castle by her son and her father, who literally drove her mad. Treated quite horrible by Philip II of Spain and his son. So she was confined for about the last 50 years of her life, and went in a castle. But more common were other mad people who began writing, and this is the first writing in English by a mad author who wrote while she was actually mad, Hannah Allen, in 1683. Very unusual for a number of reasons. First of all, she's a woman. Most women were, including in the elite, were illiterate. In fact, the very first written account we have in English by anyone who was a mad person from their own point of view was by a woman named Marjorie Kemp, who some people might remember, who's very famous in also religious writings. Her work was published in 1436, but she was illiterate and it was transcribed by two males. But this is the first writing we have actually that we know was from the hand of a mad person. It was written by, while they were actually mad in the English language, and it was written by a woman. And so that was very unusual during this time. She had a number of depressions. Her husband was away for a long time. He also died. He'd been away for about 8 years, I think it was, overseas, and then he died. She became very depressed. She tried to starve herself. She tried to self-injure herself many times. And eventually she felt it was because she turned away from God. So all of the very common up until the 1700s for mad people's perspectives and in the Western world to be depicted in religious terms, which isn't surprising since the world was very obviously rooted in religious thought and thinking at that time. It wasn't a secular world by any stretch of the imagination. And as you can see, very long titles too. They liked very long titles in those days. They literally take up the whole page. But a very important writing, because she actually dates her experiences of madness, and also very true, because sometimes she would say people would try to help her and she would swear at them or tell them to go away and damn them. And then at the same time she would feel terrible. She wanted them to be their friend, or wanted them to help her, but she pushed them away. So it's this contradictory, it's very true. If someone who's ever experienced madness knows exactly what that feeling. So it's a very honest account of how she was experienced madness, but also how difficult she was to live with for other people who were trying to help her. And she was fortunate in that she had family members. She would today be described as someone with anorexia, but that, of course, term wasn't used at that time. Bedlam, of course, most famous, it began being founded in the 15th century for, even earlier, as a hospice before that, but for 15th century is when it started receiving mad people. But we shouldn't be under any illusions that most mad people ended up in Bedlam in England, in London, England, or anywhere in England during this period. Up until the 19th century, the very few mad people were confined during this period. It was certainly a place of horror, but the vast majority of mad people didn't end up being confined until the 19th century. That was a much later development. But nevertheless, the term Bedlam comes, does anyone know what the actual original name of Bedlam? That's right, Royal Bethlehem Hospital. And the term, that's right, came corrupted to Bedlam in popular usage. So Bedlam comes from Bethlehem. And so, and this is the famous depiction by Hogarth, William Hogarth's Rake's Progress, which is a series of lithographs about a man's descent into madness, in effect, for living a dissolute life. It was a moral tale. But the end of the story was the man is literally being chained. The woman who loves him, Sybil, is crying as he's being chained by the keepers. And throughout the image, you can see all the depictions. There's the mad bishop, there's a mad tailor, a person who believes he's a king who's mad, and so on. A mad bishop, a mad musician. All the stereotypes of what mad people were supposed to be are in this. And then in the center, kind of just off to the center, there's two women nicely dressed. Does anyone know what they're doing there?
Tourists.
Exactly. Exactly. You're absolutely right. They were tourists. They paid to come and view mad people, and this was, of course, the grim part of our history, where mad people were literally paid to come and view people like they were in an exhibit. And we shouldn't think, by the way, it just happened in Britain. It happened here in Toronto. Up until 1878, the Toronto Asylum, people would come from the CNE to view people on the wards, and until the superintendent, then Daniel Clark, put an end to it. But it's a long and very grim history where people would literally be literally be viewed as exhibits. And so that's what they're doing. People would pay to come and look at them. Alexander Cruden, he's the author and a mad person who fought for the rights of prisoners and mad people. And it needs to be emphasized, this is where, when we start getting written accounts, first-person accounts, beginning, as I showed you earlier, by mad people, Hannah Allen, and a couple of centuries earlier by Marjorie Kemp, but especially in the 1700s, we start getting more first-person accounts written by people who were deemed mad. And by the way, not all of them said they were mad. Hannah Allen definitely believed she was mad. Marjorie Kemp, definitely. Marjorie Kemp, by the way, had what we would today call postpartum depression. I don't have time to go into it, but there are a long history of women who write accounts about their experiences of what we would today call postpartum depression. in the case of Alexander Cruden, he was writing about his experiences, and he had all kinds of conflicts with people. He was known as Alexander the Corrector. He would go, partly for two reasons. First, he would correct the proofs of Queen Anne's publications and published under Queen Anne, so he was in the very upper elite. He also was known as correcting people's behavior if he didn't think it was right. He wouldn't have been much fun at a party. He would have... He would have told you how to behave properly, and apparently the story goes that he heard two sailors out in the street near where he lived swearing, and he got so angry he went out and told them to stop. One of them didn't, so he hit him over the head with a shovel. So he did things that weren't appropriate, and he also harassed a woman who was not interested in him. He would go and sit near her at the church, and she didn't want him anything to do with him. So there were things about him that were not nice. We shouldn't depict mad people like disabled people as all nice or all saints any more than anywhere out there. They have faults like anyone else. And Alexander Cruden certainly had lots of faults. He would have been very difficult to get along with, but it also had to be said he was treated horrible. And he wrote about these experiences when he was locked up in a madhouse, because beginning in the 1700s, madhouses began being set up in the late 1600s, early 1700s in Britain and other parts of Western Europe. And people were sent there when they were considered too troublesome by family members. And he was confined for a long period, about 9 months, and he wrote about his experiences. And after that, and if this happened to him, he was at the upper crust of the Anglican elite. He was way up there. If this happened to him, one could only imagine what it was like for people much lower down, because there also began to establish madhouses for the poorest mad people during this time. So he's very unusual. If you could hold your question a minute, that would be great. Thank you. He was very unusual because he was a member of the upper elite who fought for the rights also of prisoners as well as mad people, and he was totally ostracized by the elite. They basically thought, this guy is just, forget it. He's way out of there. So he was totally isolated for the rest of his life. He was originally confined in 1739, and he lived for another over 30 more years. And he fought for the rights of poor prisoners, which is very unusual for someone who was in the upper elite. So he fought for the rights of both mad people and for prisoners who were amongst the lowest people in society at that time, both in terms of class and social status. So he had many faults, but he also had many good things that need to be emphasized about him. And so the story goes, he was also very devout, and so the story goes, when he died, he was found in his room, literally kneeling against his bed, dead. So he fought a lot, but he was also ostracized for his views during this period. This is a 1739 publication protesting the abuses of mad people, and a lot of the early accounts, they make comparisons with the Inquisition, which of course were done to critique the way in which mad people were treated rather. Samuel Brookshaw in 1774 wrote another denunciation as well, as did William Belcher in 1796. So these again are all members of the elite who had resources and the skills and literacy to be able to write their accounts. And if you read what happened to them, such as Samuel Belcher, who was confined for 17 years because he said people wanted his property, and he says he wasn't mad when he went in, but by the time he came out, he was mad because of the horrible way in which he was treated, and also just the anguish of knowing people were stealing your property and locking me up. So it was dreadful what happened to so many of them. And so there's they tended to be rich people and well-to-do people who wrote the person accounts. It really was until the 19th century we got more varied accounts from a broader cross-section. There's Pinnell's famous Unchaining of Mad People. This is a famous depiction of depicting unchaining a woman at the Salpêtrière in Paris, 1793. Pinnell is the man in the hat that Napoleon later would make famous. The argument is that this was a great advancement in humanitarian care, and yes, it was if it actually was maintained, but unfortunately it wasn't. There continued to be restraining of mad people, even though there was a debate about not restraining people in institutions. Nevertheless, they continued to happen, and large institutions continued to be built throughout the Western world, particularly in the 19th century, eventually to replace madhouses by the mid-19th century, mid-1800s, so that more and more people were confined in large-scale institutions like this one in New York, and you saw the Queen Street one a few minutes earlier, and I showed you the picture. And so as more urbanization increased, more people lived in crowded tenements, more people observed other people's behavior, more people ended up in madhouses as well. And also because of industrialization and the stresses with it, a lot of psychological stress happened because of the wear and tear of what happening in people's individual lives. So this is a diagram of St. Elizabeth's Hospital, which was opened in Washington, D.C., 1855. And if you were at the front of the ward of the asylum, you were relatively well-to-do. Your family or yourself were able to pay for private room or semi-private room, but the further back you move, the poorer you become. So that by the time you're in the back wards, you're in the most crowded, miserable places. So the back wards have a justifiable, very bad history. And even further back, it shows how wretched it was for people who are especially on the lower lungs. It says here, lodge for colored women, lodge for colored men. There was a racial segregation of asylum inmates during this period as well. And up to the 1950s and 60s in the United States, African Americans were treated the worst in the asylums. And we shouldn't be so superior to say, oh, the Americans, we wouldn't do that in Canada. Well, actually, Canadians of Chinese descent were also segregated in the asylums in BC into the late 19th, early 20th century, and made to do the dirtiest work. So there was also a class and racial hierarchy in the institutions as well. And so that's important to emphasize. And so there are lots of writings during this period as the institutions became more common and as literacy spread, more people started writing about their experience. Isaac Hunt, about his protesting about the abuses he experienced in the asylum in Maine. This is a famous picture of Ebenezer Haskell. He's right here. Now, mind you, this is perhaps a bit of a fanciful painting. Most people don't jump over a wall wearing a nice top hat and evening clothes, but in fact, in his depiction, he wrote about how their hair was all shaved. So this, we can sure, is not how he really looked when he escaped. But it's a famous a story where he had brought out about the abuses that happened, and he fought for the rights of asylum inmates. Elizabeth, during the 1860s, Elizabeth Packard is probably the most famous 19th century advocate for mad people during the 19th century. She was confined by her husband on the word of her husband in 1860 at the collusion of a doctor because she had two major disagreements with her husband Theophilus, which was one, she didn't like how he treated their children. She didn't agree with corporal punishment. He did. And two, she was totally against slavery and was for abolition. In 1860, we know that was the number one issue as the Civil War was about to break out. And he was for slavery, and so he thought she was mad. So he had her literally confined for 3 years in an asylum. And it became a huge cause célèbre, and she fought for her release through her children. Her children were minors. Her children also came in the campaign. There's a long story which I don't have time for. After she became, this is her being taken to the train and being confined, and this is the institution where she was confined in Illinois. And these are some of her writings. After she was released in 1863, for the rest of her life, till her death in 1897, she fought for legal changes to asylum inmates' rights, particularly that women can be locked up just on the say-so of their husband, although that did continue to happen, but nevertheless she fought for changes in the laws, and also she fought for things which in some cases wouldn't happen for over 100 years. She's way ahead of her time. If you're an asylum inmate, you couldn't mail your letters without going through the staff, so letters could be confiscated. She said, if you're an asylum inmate, you should have the right to freedom of mail. And so she fought for a lot of things. And she also paid a price for it. She got a lot of hate mail and a lot of social ostracism. And she also put her money where her mouth was. She made a lot of money giving talks and advocating, and she put it back into publishing the writings of other people who were mad, particularly women who experienced being in the asylum and who couldn't afford to be published. So she literally paid for poor people to have their writings published. So she's a very important figure in this history. At a time when to be public as a mad person, like she was like social death in the 19th century, and especially for mad women who were particularly ostracized. By the way, I should emphasize, she never felt she was mad. She didn't, but she felt that people genuinely needed help in some ways that wasn't being provided in the asylums, and so that needs to be emphasized as well. Richard Nesbitt, there's lots of mad people's creativity who created this map in 1815. There's also famous mad people, Robert Schumann, who I'm sure all heard of, the great pianist who who ended up dying in an asylum in Bonn in 1856 after being confined for 2 years. His wife was even told not to visit him, which tormented him immensely. Dr. Richards, who was his doctor, has been pretty well denounced for the way in which he mistreated Robert Schumann. And his wife Clara, of course, was a great pianist in her own right. King Ludwig of Bavaria, whose death in 1886 with his doctor is still debated. Some people say it was murder, others said it was suicide, we don't know. Just the two of them were found dead in the water, and he was confined. He was also gay, so there was also pathologizing of sexual orientation as well.
Lots of syphilis at that time.
Pardon me?
Lots of syphilis at that time.
Yes. Syphilis was very much comes up in the records as well. He created this castle, which is based on Walt Disney's castle, of course, which Walt Disney rather, based on his castle. He was a bit before Walt Disney, so he had all kinds of things. So these are some of the more famous, but of course much closer to home, 999 Queen Street, much of which was built by asylum inmates. As you can see here, this picture was taken in 1868. And as I mentioned before, it was the biggest building of its kind in Canada West, or the province of Ontario, as it later came to be called, after it was opened. The building was opened in 1850. And the sidewalks there, you can see, amongst other things, were actually built by and maintained by patients, as were many of the buildings on site. And so this is a picture of the old asylum, and these walls, which still exist to this day, Queen and Shaw, and on the east side, Queen and Shaw, on the south side, and on the west side, were all built by asylum inmates. The old asylum itself was all torn down in the mid-70s. Excuse me. Pardon me. But these walls still exist after there's a campaign to save them by Psych Survivor Archives and the CAMH Heritage, CAMH Archives and others in the heritage community to save them. And so as a monument to the patients who built the walls and a testament to their labor, which is very important. And so it's very important to emphasize who this history belongs to. Tom, who was confined for 63 years in asylum, was in 2 different asylums, the London Asylum and Queen Street. Esther, this picture was taken in 1908, 2 months before she died. It's very much her history. She was a farm woman. Her husband died. She thought she heard his voice, so her family put her in the asylum, and she died there 2 years later. And I wondered, the nice shawl she had, maybe she made it. She lived her whole life on the farm, so one can only imagine living in a rural environment and being put in Queen Street Asylum, the huge shock that must have been to her. And this picture was just taken shortly before he died. Jim, who was a patient there from 1898 till 1941, who did a great deal of work in the institution. Mayef, picture taken of her in 1938, at the age of 67. She did a huge amount of domestic work for the nurses in their residence. She lived at Queen Street from 1898 till her death in 1952, and she was an orphan as well. So many people were confined there who literally were socially marginalized in many ways and had no other sorts of supports. Randall was also confined there. He worked in the tailor shop, and he was there until his death in 1944. Matilda, she worked there a few months. She worked in the dining room and laundry. This was taken at the age of 76 in 1938. Alex C. was also another patient. He was there for a long time. I found all these pictures in their patient files, by the way, at the Archives of Ontario. And Alice G., she was a patient. This picture was taken 6 months before she died in 1937. She was a patient there for 45 years, beginning in 1893. And in her file, it mentioned, I came across how she said, it mentions, patient says she no longer wishes to work in laundry. Doesn't say why. She was at that time in her early 80s, 83 years old. So it gives you an idea of how many long patients were had to work. Michael was also a patient at Queen Street for the last 44 years. And Anne D. was also a patient from 1906 to 44. Her husband severely abused her and literally drove her mad. He then went to Calgary and married another woman, so he was a bigamist. And she had only as her advocate her sister, who was a nurse in Boston, who would come and visit every so often and would come and support her sister. But she was totally abandoned by her husband, who is a reminder of literally violence in a person's life, literally driving one mad. And and ended her days in the asylum as a result of her victim of domestic abuse. Audrey B. Is a patient who was at Queen Street from 1905 to 46. She did a huge amount of work in the sewing room, was repeatedly complimented for her work as a sewer, and she did a great deal of toil, worked for over 30 years in the sewing room, and it doesn't say in her file, but I wonder if that picture of the shawl that she's wearing was made by her. I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised because she's repeatedly emphasized how much she was an expert seamstress. She moved during the picture, by the way, that's why it's slightly blurred. But she too was forgotten by her family, and most of these people were buried in unmarked graves when they died, in Prospect Cemetery and the one that's now, it's quite, what's wrong with the one near Davisville, Mount Pleasant, thank you, yes, Mount Pleasant, we're buried in Mount Pleasant as well. And so it's very much their history, this picture of Jim in his file, and also to files many patients whose, we don't have photos like Ralph, but who left writings. Many patients left writings that were put in their files. It was said that they were experiencing madness, and so you had absolutely no right, if you were a patient, to have a right of correspondence. If you want to write a letter to your mother, your father, your wife, your husband, your children, any loved one, a brother, sister, or your lawyer, you had no right of correspondence. Absolutely none. Your letter could be taken from you and put in your file, and that's where I found many of them, including this letter from Ralph. You might see at the very top, my very dear wife. So I read the letter in the I found this letter in the Archives of Ontario that was meant for his wife who never got it. And you can just imagine what that must have meant. A woman named Felicity T. styled herself Angel Queen the 13th, also wrote all sorts of letters, and here she's writing that she wants certain types of spools for her knitting. She would make great big gowns. She was from one of the more privileged patients. Her family paid for her to get a lot of different spools and clothing for her, so she was among the more privileged patients. And she also advocated for other patients too in her writings. And Henrietta also was another patient. You can see very fancy writing. These were all found in their files. And Walter, who left drawings. So there are lots of drawings in the asylum. So these are really the most of the patients are the patients like this whose names generally don't come down through history because they're not famous, but they made up the majority of patients, which is very important to emphasize. This letter is from Francis B. Francis wrote this letter from the Toronto Asylum, September the 18th, 1896. Is it okay? Okay, and in that letter, I just wanted to read you what he wrote. He wrote it September 18, 1896. He's writing to to not the superintendent, but the inspector of all asylums, which is, instead of, say, writing to the dean of your faculty, you're writing to the president of the whole university. So he's going over the head of the superintendent to write to the president, and in effect. And he wrote, "Your Honor, sir, I write you these few lines to ask if you would be kind enough to give my discharge, for I have been so long here. The judge only said for such time as I would get better. Mr. Nolan and my uncle came in and told me that I was free, only they could not take me out as I was under you." That letter was never, ever answered. It was instead stamped by the inspector, sent back to the superintendent, put in his file, where I found it almost 100 years later. What happened to Francis B., who was from a farming background? He had originally been confined in 1877, 19 years before this letter was written. 23 years after the letter was written, in 1919, 42 years after he was first confined, Francis went out onto the lawn of Queen Street. He was one of the patients who did have what was called parole of the lawn at that time. Most didn't, but he did. And in June 1919, he ended his life on the lawn, in the shadow of the wall that still exists there. And as he lay dying, they asked him why, and he said, "It's no use living any longer. I am just dust." And that's recorded in his file. So we always try to remember poor patients like Francis, who literally had no one. Imagine the anguish of writing a letter to anybody, but especially your loved one, or to someone who you think would try to help you be discharged or come to see you, and getting no response. And I actually found letters in the patient files which complain about their letters not being sent out, and those letters were in turn confiscated. So including from Alex, whose picture I showed you. And so there's also been efforts in the period since deinstitutionalization to fight for the rights of people who have been psychiatric patients on a more organized basis. And one of those was the man in the bottom of this picture here. His name is Aldo Alviani, and he had been given too many medications, overdrugged, and died. And so a nurse let this be known and blew the whistle, so to speak. And so there was a demonstration to protest his treatment, which was the first march in Ontario history by mad people or people who are ex-psychiatric patients or current patients at Queen's Park on October 3, 1980. And it led to eventually, there was a series of cases, Aldo Alviani was one of them, that led to the creation of the Psychiatric Patients Advocates Office, or the PPAO, that was set up under the provincial government. Larry Grossman, if you remember Larry Grossman, who was the Minister of Health then, was one of the people who was involved at the government level trying to change it, or trying to get this installed. And you can see some individual MPs and members of the local community who are involved in pushing this forward. So this is what happens when our history is forgotten. And I'll just end on these. It looks, well, what's this? You might say, there's a fence there. Oh, no. Do anyone know the corner of Horner and Evans in Etobicoke? Okay, very good. Some of you might know now that this is a graveyard with 1,511 people are there, buried there. And when I first came to York 10 years ago, I started talking about this place, this graveyard, and a colleague of mine, Professor Gary Bunch, whom some of you may know, who's since retired, was shocked. He said he had no idea there was a graveyard there. He'd lived in Etobicoke for years. And it's true, most people had no idea there was a graveyard there. The graves were largely markers, those few that existed, 154 out of 1,511 were covered and buried. They were buried, and 1,357 had no grave marker. I took these pictures in March of 2005, so you can kind of see. And some of the graves literally had fallen in. This was a grave of Florence R., though I didn't know that at the time. We only found out because a few months later we had an event where we literally uncovered the graves. Before these pictures were taken, by the way, they cut the grass, but the grass a few months before these pictures were taken was like this like up to your waist. So this is what happens, and there's a long history of Ed Janishevsky, the man in the checkered shirt, is the person who is particularly responsible for the restoration of the cemetery, which those of you probably who are in the Etobicoke know now is marked and has a nice fence, and it's now publicly marked. And Ed Janishevsky, Graham was one of the people who took these pictures. That's Ed right there, was the one primarily responsible for helping to create this, make sure that it was properly marked along with community activists. But this is a long history of a neglect of the cemeteries and the burial places of people who are mad in an institution. That happens all over the Western world. Not just to mad people, people with developmental disabilities, where in one case in British Columbia woodlands, where they took the gravestones which existed and put them, and the staff put them and made them into a patio for a barbecue pit. So literally desecrated the graves. And so there's been efforts to reclaim these cemeteries now. And this is one of many efforts. And there was an effort to have a demonstration to preserve the cemetery and respect people. Within 2 days of that sign being put on there, it was stolen off it. But now, fortunately, after many years, it took about 9 or 10 years of advocacy, but now it's publicly marked, so, and with a plaque, so it's respectfully done. I'll just very quickly go through. There's been a lot. Do I have about 1 minute left? Sure. 1 minute, thank you. So I'll just zip right through these, thank you. There's a lot of patient activist groups that have been established, and their work is preserved by the Psychiatric Survivor Archives in Toronto. Just since in the period since deinstitutionalization, a lot of self-advocates have been involved in fighting for the rights of people with psychiatric history. And I'm just giving you some examples here. The Cuckoo's Nest, published by Pat Capone. Phoenix Rising is a well-known publication. Mad Grapevine. Quebec City publication La Coyote, Still Sane. Queen Street Patient Council, which is now called the Empowerment Council. Madness Network News in San Francisco. The Not So Patient Voice from Ohio in 1978. A Coalition Against Electroshock in 1979. And groups in Sao Paulo, Brazil. I don't read Portuguese, but if you read Portuguese, you could be able to to get these. The man who collected these, Alan Markman, who donated to the archives, Psychic Survivor Archives, actually could read Portuguese, so he preserved a lot of these. And other groups, such as this group in London, in Holland, in Denmark, Oslo, and elsewhere. So there's been all sorts of activist groups that have started to peer support groups and rights groups that are hoping to promote the rights of people with psychiatric disabilities or experiencing madness to provide, to stop the sort of abuses that have happened in the past and to provide for more rights in the community that have been often neglected or not supported. And so that's why I want to emphasize that this sort of history has been going on for literally hundreds of years. It's not just since the 1960s that there are activist groups that have been around, but literally going back hundreds of years. But also, even besides activist groups, there have been people who have never been in activist groups, who didn't have that opportunity, but who have had a long history, literally going back thousands of years, of experiencing madness and the need to respect the voices of people who have had these experiences throughout history. So that's a very quick ending of it, so I'd be glad to answer any questions.